On January 16, 1984, 43-year-old Kay Schwartz sat down to dinner with her 51-year-old husband Bob and their kids, Larry and Annie. The kitchen of their split-level home had a window that looked out into the backyard, and they could all see snow falling outside. The Schwartz's neighborhood in Cape St. Clair, Maryland, a suburb of Annapolis, was quiet and secluded, but the snow made it feel even quieter and further away from the rest of the world than usual. And Bob worried that if the weather got any worse, he might have trouble driving into work the following day. But then he heard Kay starting to pray, so he looked away from the window and bowed his head. Kay finished her short prayer, and then the rest of the family said Amen, and then they all started eating. Dinner time with the family was always Kay's favorite part of the day. Ever since she was young, she dreamed of having a close-knit family that sat down together every night to share a meal and talk about how their days had gone. And now, Kay's dream had come true. She watched as her 17-year-old son Larry and her 9-year-old daughter Annie dug into their dinner, and she looked over at Bob and smiled. Bob took a drink and then smiled back. Dinner with the family was his favorite time too, because just like Kay, he'd always wanted to have a house full of kids. In fact, it was Kay and Bob's shared love of family that had first drawn them to each other when they met in graduate school at the University of Maryland 16 years earlier. At least that's what they told all of their friends. The truth was, the first thing that had drawn Bob to Kay was her looks. The first time he saw her in one of the campus parking lots, he couldn't stop staring. Kay was 5 foot 10 inches tall with long legs and a long neck, her brown hair was cropped short, and she had a perfect smile. Bob thought she looked like a model. And Bob, generally speaking, did not have the confidence to talk to women who looked like models. He was short and stocky, and he'd lost most of his hair in his early 20s, which had always made him a little insecure, but once he'd seen Kay, he couldn't stop thinking about her. So when he saw her again eating lunch in the university cafeteria, he took a deep breath, walked right up to her, and started a conversation. And Bob would always be happy that he'd taken that risk, because he and Kay had hit it off immediately and discovered they had a lot in common. They were both devoutly religious, they believed education was the key to success, and they put their love of family above all else. And so, soon after that first meeting, they were spending as much time together as they could. And within a few months, they were already planning their future together. But not long after they'd gotten married, Kay learned that she was not capable of having children of her own. This made her feel like a failure, like she was letting Bob down, and that their dream of having a big, happy family would now never come true. But after Kay and Bob spent time talking and praying together, they started to look at this seemingly bad news as a sort of gift. They decided that if they couldn't have kids of their own, they would adopt and provide a loving home for children who had never been fortunate enough to have families of their own. So, in 1973, they adopted Larry when he was 6 years old. And when Larry arrived, he felt like he was the luckiest kid in the world. He had spent his childhood in and out of foster care and never felt like he had parents, but now Kay and Bob had taken him in, and he was sure he had found his forever home. And Larry was everything Kay and Bob could have hoped for in a son. He was sweet, polite, fun to be around, and he even enjoyed going to church with his parents. Larry's adoption was such a success that pretty much right away, Kay and Bob began talking about adopting more children. And 6 years after Larry joined the family, Kay and Bob adopted Annie from South Korea when she was 4 years old. Annie, like Larry, was just incredible to be around from the moment she arrived at their home. Her smile was infectious, and she was smart, curious, and always happy. Bob and Kay adored Annie, and Larry made it his mission to be the best big brother he could possibly be to his new sister. So, back in the present, in 1984, while Kay ate her dinner with her family that night, she was very happy with how her life as a mother had gone so far. But, deep down, she couldn't help but feel a sense of loss, because there was one empty chair at the dinner table where Kay and Bob's third adopted child used to sit. Less than 2 years after Kay and Bob had adopted Larry, and about 4 years before they adopted Annie, they adopted another boy named Michael. At the time, Michael was 8 years old, about 6 months older than Larry, and Kay and Bob hoped the two boys would become fast friends and soon grow into devoted brothers. But Michael struggled to adapt to his new life. His birth parents had abandoned him when he was an infant, and by the time he was adopted by Kay and Bob, he'd already lived in 6 different foster homes and developed a serious distrust of authority figures. And as a result, Michael clashed with his adoptive father, Bob, right away, mainly because Bob could be strict, especially when it came to school. And when Michael struggled in school, Bob would yell at him and ground him, and this would cause Michael to act out. And while Kay wasn't as strict as Bob, she was still a high school teacher, and she took education very seriously. So she couldn't understand why Michael didn't even seem to care about his grades. But when she tried to talk to him about it, he would get frustrated with her, and before long, they'd be shouting at each other. From the beginning, things between Michael and his new parents just didn't seem to be working out. And when Annie joined the family in late 1978, the Michael situation got much worse. Michael accused Bob and Kay of loving Annie more than they loved him, and Michael just seemed to go out of his way to start arguments with his parents, which made life very challenging for everyone in that house, especially Larry, because all Larry wanted was for everyone to be happy and to get along. And so, when Michael fought with Kay and Bob, Larry would try to talk Michael down and keep the peace. But Larry, who was sweet and soft-spoken, rarely had any luck calming Michael down, or getting his parents to go easier on Michael. It was like both sides were unwilling to compromise on any issue. As Michael got older, the arguments between him and his parents became more frequent and more heated. And when Michael became a teenager, he started getting in trouble at school for fighting, and when he got home from school, he would yell and scream at his parents almost every day. Around this time, Kay and Bob started to feel like they had totally lost control of their second son. Then, on a night in 1980, when Michael was 14 years old, the tension between he and his parents reached a breaking point. That night, Michael had asked Kay and Bob if he could go hang out with some of his friends, but they had told him no, that he needed to stay home and do his schoolwork. Michael was furious, and after screaming at his parents, he just snuck out of the house and met up with his friends. But when he got home later that night, Kay and Bob were waiting for him by the front door, and they told him that they had had enough of his bad behavior and that he was not allowed to come back inside. And they didn't just mean for that night. They meant forever. They were disowning him. The following day, Kay and Bob contacted social services, and Michael was taken away and sent to a reform school, which is an institution where youth offenders are sent as an alternative to prison. Kay felt absolutely terrible about this decision, but with Michael now gone, at least Larry and Annie would hopefully have a happier, healthier, and less disruptive home. Now sitting at the kitchen table, staring at Michael's empty seat, Kay tried to remind herself that that decision she and her husband had made a few years earlier had been the only decision they could have made. After all, they had recently learned from social services that Michael, who was now 17, had had to be moved from the reform school to a mental institution because of his erratic behavior. And so, at least to Kay and Bob, this only seemed to prove that Michael would not have worked out long-term in their family. But deep down, whenever Kay thought about Michael, she couldn't help but feel like a failure. That night, after dinner, Bob got up from the table and headed to his home office that he'd set up in a small room located in the basement. Bob had gotten in on the ground floor of the growing computer industry, and he enjoyed the work and the money it brought in for him and his family. But the job sometimes required him to do work from home late into the night. And Kay knew that once Bob disappeared into his basement office, there was a good chance the rest of the family would not see him until the following morning. So Kay cleared the kitchen table with Larry's help, and then she and Annie headed upstairs. As Kay helped Annie get ready for bed, Larry came into Annie's bedroom and said goodnight to her before he walked back into the hall and headed for his own room. Kay gave Annie a kiss, said goodnight, and headed out into the hall just a moment after Larry had. Annie heard the sound of her brother's bedroom door shutting, and she heard her mother walking down the stairs. And soon after that, Annie's eyes got heavy and she fell asleep. But then, a couple of hours later, at around 11:30 p.m., Annie suddenly woke up because she heard what she thought were the sound of voices in the hall right outside her room. So Annie rubbed her eyes, climbed out of bed, and stumbled to her door, still half asleep. But when she opened her door, she realized the voices were not coming from the hallway, they were coming from downstairs. And the voices she heard were not people talking, but rather people screaming. Annie took a step into the hall, and instantly the screaming stopped. But Annie was still very worried and wanted to know what was going on, so she slowly walked downstairs, but when she got down there, the first floor was quiet and deserted. And as she stood there looking around in the dark, she suddenly thought she heard something outside the house. So she walked through the living room to a sliding glass door that looked out into the backyard where she heard the sound, and the moonlight, it was bouncing off the snow and created just enough light for Annie to get a good look at the backyard. And what she saw out there terrified her. In fact, Annie, after seeing it, she would turn and run back upstairs, dive into her bed, and pull the covers up over her head. And as she lay there, she told herself that this could not be real, that this had to be a bad dream. The following morning, Annie woke up and the house felt cold and quiet. She thought about what she'd seen the night before, but she was sure now that it really must have just been a nightmare, because if it hadn't been, if it had been real, wouldn't her brother or parents have come and got her and told her what was going on? Feeling somewhat reassured by this thought, Annie got out of bed and walked into the hall. She called out for her parents, but no one answered, so Annie walked downstairs to see where people were. But when she didn't see or hear anyone on the first floor, she started to get scared. So Annie ran back up the stairs to Larry's room, she opened the door, and she found him asleep in his bed. She shook him awake, and when he rolled over, she told him that she couldn't find their parents. Larry could tell that Annie was definitely scared, and so immediately became the big brother and tried to calm her down by telling her everything was okay and that their parents likely had just gone outside for a minute and they'd be back soon. Then he climbed out of his bed, took his little sister's hand, and together they walked downstairs. But when they got downstairs, Larry happened to look out the kitchen window into the backyard, and when he did, he stopped moving. He pressed his face against the glass and squinted to get a clear view of the yard, and when he did, his eyes went wide, and he instinctively reached over and covered Annie's eyes with his hand so she couldn't see what he was seeing. Then he picked his sister up and he ran to the phone to call 911. And as he ran, neither he nor Annie seemed to notice the red drops all over everything. A 31-year-old detective from the Anne of Arundel County Police, named Gary Barr, arrived at the neat little home in the quiet suburban neighborhood, and right away, the officers who'd already responded to Larry's frantic 911 call led the detective into the family's backyard. And when Detective Barr got out there and saw the scene, he just stopped and stared. Like Larry, the detective had a hard time processing what was in front of him. Detective Barr was a former Marine, and he'd seen some gruesome things during his time in the military, but he'd never seen anything like this. The ground in front of him, about 10 feet away from the sliding glass door at the back of the house, was covered in a dark red slush, from where massive amounts of blood had mixed with the snow overnight. And just beyond the bloody slush, a few feet ahead of him, he saw a dead body partially covered in fresh snow. The detective took a deep breath of cold air, then slowly circled around the blood-soaked part of the yard and approached the body. The body belonged to Kay Schwartz. She was lying face down in the snow, her neck was covered in blood, and she was completely naked except for having a sock on one of her feet. Barr directed a few members of his team to remain in the backyard to take photos of Kay's body and to further investigate the area. Then he walked through the backyard to the open sliding glass door that led into the house. And on that glass door, Detective Barr saw part of a bloody palm print that the officers who'd first arrived on the scene had discovered as well. Barr knew the print was a significant clue, but at the time, in order to learn anything from the print, the police would have to send samples to the FBI forensics lab in Washington, D.C., because the FBI had the technology to run the appropriate tests. Detective Barr spoke with other officers nearby to confirm that the samples would be sent off quickly to D.C., but Barr knew even if they got sent today, it would be weeks before they would hear anything from the FBI. And so Barr was not willing to pin the hopes of the entire investigation on this palm print that could even turn out to belong to the victim and not the killer. And so Detective Barr stepped through the door into the house to begin looking for more clues, but once again, as soon as he was inside, he had to just stop and stare at what was in front of him. There were pools and streaks of dried blood on the floor leading from the back door where he was to the living room. And when Barr stepped into the living room, he saw blood spatter all over the walls. He still had no idea what had happened, but he knew whoever had done this had been filled with rage during the attack. And the blood didn't stop in the living room. Barr found more splatter on the steps nearby that led down into the basement. So Barr followed that path of blood and eventually wound up in the small room in the basement, Bob's office. And once inside, he saw blood everywhere, and in the corner on the floor was Bob. He was deceased and had obvious cuts on his hands, chest, and neck. As members of the investigation team photographed and searched Bob's office, Detective Barr wandered back through the house and then walked out the front door. He hoped the cold air outside would help clear his head. He was in shock at what he'd seen inside the house because things like this just didn't happen in safe, quiet neighborhoods in Cape St. Clair. Barr stood there just breathing in the fresh air for a minute, and then he walked across the street towards one of the Schwartz's neighbors' houses. When Barr had arrived at the crime scene, he'd told one of his officers to take Larry and Annie to this neighbor's house and to wait for him there. And so when Barr walked inside that neighbor's house, the officer was there with the two kids. Larry was wearing a pajama shirt, jeans, and high-top sneakers, and Annie was in a long nightshirt. As Barr approached the children, he saw Larry holding Annie's hand, gently consoling her. Larry was a relatively small and skinny kid, but it was clear to Barr that Larry was trying to act big and strong for his sister's sake. Barr walked up to the kids, and he first turned to Larry, and in a calm voice, he asked the child if he had noticed anything unusual the night before. Larry apologized and said he couldn't be much help. He told the detective that he'd gone to his room not long after dinner, looked at some notes from his Spanish class, and then went to bed. He didn't hear or see anything until the following morning when he and his sister had gone downstairs together to look for their parents, and that's when Larry had looked out the window and seen his mother in the snow and dialed 911. Then, without Barr asking, Annie suddenly lifted up her head and said that she had seen something the night before. Barr immediately crouched down to get to Annie's eye level and then asked her what she had seen. Annie told him that she'd woken up in the middle of the night because she thought people were talking outside of her room. But then, when she went into the hall, she heard screaming coming from downstairs. When the screaming suddenly stopped, she went downstairs to see what was going on, but when she got there, it was all quiet. Then, she told the detective that she thought she had heard something outside, so she whipped around and looked out the door that opened into the backyard, and that was when she saw the terrifying thing that sent her running back up to her room and under her covers. Annie said she'd seen a very tall man with dark curly hair slowly walking away from their house. As she said this, Barr noticed Larry's eyes go wide, and then the boy started shaking his head. When Barr asked him what was wrong, Larry told him that the man Annie said she'd seen outside fit the description of their estranged brother, Michael, who was 6'4" tall and had dark curly hair. Detective Barr didn't know what to say. These poor kids who had finally found a safe and loving home with their adoptive parents had just lost that family and their new lives in a single day. Barr smiled at Annie and Larry and thanked them for their help. Then, leaving them there with the neighbors and the other officer who had brought them there, Detective Barr walked back outside and headed back across the street to the Schwartz's house. As he walked, he knew one of his next moves would be to investigate his new primary suspect, Michael. Other than the bloody palm print, police had very little physical evidence from the scene of the crime. So, Barr and the other investigators began to question the Schwartz's friends, families, and other associates to learn everything they could about the family. And through those conversations, Barr would learn that not long before Michael had left the house for good 4 years earlier, his outbursts with Bob had gone from just screaming fights to physical fights. And some of the neighbors were willing to admit that they thought Bob had most likely hit Michael on several occasions. And Barr also learned from a family friend that Michael had threatened to kill Kay and Bob, and that he had allegedly said that all he'd have to do was grab a knife and stab them. Barr knew that the threat of murder made Michael, who was already the prime suspect, look even more guilty, but Barr quickly discovered a major problem with the theory that Michael was the killer. Because Michael, who resided in a state mental hospital for psychiatric evaluation, had apparently been at the hospital on the night of the murders, at least according to hospital records. But Barr wasn't willing to take those records at face value. He wanted to meet with Michael in person because Michael simply had too many red flags to ignore. And so, days after the murder, Detective Barr drove out to pay Michael a visit at the mental hospital, which was a little over 10 miles away from the Schwartz's house. When Barr arrived, a staff member from the hospital led him through the building, and Barr was horrified by the conditions he found. Screams from patients echoed from a large open room packed with beds. The floors and walls looked like they hadn't been cleaned in months, and Barr couldn't tell who, if anyone, was in charge of the place. He was also taken aback by how little security there seemed to be in the hospital. In fact, by the time he stepped into the room where he was supposed to meet Michael, he was convinced Michael could have easily slipped out of the hospital, made the relatively short trip to the Schwartz's house, carried out the murders, and made it back to the hospital without anyone on staff ever noticing. Barr took a seat in a metal chair across a metal table from Michael. The room they were in was cramped, and the fluorescent light overhead cast a sickly glow on the dirty white walls. But Barr didn't notice any of that, because from the moment he sat down, he was fixated on Michael's neck. There were several red marks on one side of Michael's long, muscular neck, and so Barr asked Michael if he had gotten those marks in a fight. But Michael just grinned and told the detective the marks were actually hickeys that he'd gotten while making out with a girl he knew. Barr smiled back and then proceeded to tell Michael about what happened to his former adoptive parents. And Michael didn't seem remotely fazed by this horrible news. He just sat there, calm as can be. But Detective Barr was experienced enough to know that Michael's reaction to what he was told was not necessarily proof of guilt or innocence. And so Barr began asking basic questions, starting with, where was Michael on the night Bob and Kay were killed, January 16th? And Michael's answer, which was delivered just as calmly as his reaction to the news about his former parents, was simple. He'd been right here in the hospital where the state of Maryland had put him. But Barr wasn't convinced Michael was being honest, so he leaned across the table, looked Michael right in the eyes, and pushed him to talk about his troubled relationship with his adoptive parents and the threats of violence he'd made against them in the past. Barr had hoped this approach might kind of rattle Michael and maybe get him to accidentally give something away, but this didn't happen. Michael stayed calm and stuck to his story. He had been at the hospital when they were killed, period. By the time Barr left the hospital, he was very frustrated. Between the hospital's obviously lax security and Michael's bizarre, nonchalant reaction and answers that he gave, it just seemed like Michael had to be lying, that he really had to be the killer. But without physical evidence from the crime scene or any kind of confession from Michael, Barr knew he was going to have to keep working to prove this theory. And not long after this initial meeting with Michael, Detective Barr's job got even harder. Because right after Barr left the mental hospital, Michael contacted a defense attorney who advised him not to speak with anyone from law enforcement about the murders of Kay and Bob Schwartz. And so, a couple of days later, when Barr tried to set up another meeting with Michael at the hospital, he was refused. Now, Barr felt like he was running out of options, because in addition to not being able to speak to his primary suspect, he was still waiting to hear back from the FBI with the results of the tests they'd run on the bloody palm print. So, feeling like he was at a dead end, Barr went back to the drawing board and tried to find any other leads that might help him discover exactly what had happened to Kay and Bob. While investigators had been questioning people who were close to Kay and Bob, they discovered that, like Barr, most of these people thought Michael was probably the killer. But there was one person who investigators spoke to that offered a tip that sent Barr's investigation in an entirely new direction. A friend of the family informed Barr that Bob had been a staunch anti-abortion activist and that he had spent significant amounts of time publicly protesting an abortion clinic in the area. And it turned out that Bob's protests had often turned aggressive, and he'd possibly made some enemies in the process. So Detective Barr did his job and tracked down people who worked at the clinic and some of Bob's fellow protesters. But as the days went by, he felt like this was all just a big distraction, and he didn't think this line of questioning was getting him any closer to solving the case. Because Detective Barr was sure that Michael must have at least been involved in the murders. So Barr abandoned the abortion clinic theory and decided to just basically wait for the FBI to send back the test results from the bloody print that had been found on the sliding glass door at the murder scene. And finally, in March of 1984, almost 2 months after Bob and Kay were murdered, the results arrived. And as Detective Barr expected, these test results would break the case wide open. However, the results would lead Detective Barr down a path he had not even considered during his initial investigation. Based on the test results from the FBI, evidence found at the scene of the crime, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe took place at the Schwartz home on the night Kay and Bob died, January 16, 1984. At around 11:30 p.m. on January 16th, snow was on the ground outside the Schwartz home and the temperature was well below freezing. But sweat dripped down the killer's forehead as they walked through the Schwartz house towards the living room. The killer felt lightheaded, and they could still feel the slight burn in their stomach from the shots of rum they'd drunk only a few minutes earlier. The killer stopped a few feet from the living room, hidden in the shadows, and listened to the sound of the television. Then they poked their head around the corner and saw, in the glow of the TV, there was a woman wearing blue flannel pajamas, Kay, sitting in a black vinyl chair, watching the TV. In front of her was a small table with the remains of what looked like her late-night snack, an empty plate, a fork, and a sharp steak knife. The killer was not actually carrying a weapon. In reality, they had not fully mapped out how this attack would go, but the steak knife on Kay's table seemed like the perfect solution. So the killer took a few steps into the living room, but then suddenly stopped. And as they looked at Kay sitting there peacefully watching TV, they started to have second thoughts about what they were about to do. But then the killer took a long, deep breath and told themselves this was the right move. And then they continued to walk through the living room towards Kay. The killer's footsteps caused the wooden floors to creak as they moved. Kay heard those creaks and quickly looked up from the TV to see who was there. And when she saw, she was startled, but mostly she was angry, and she yelled something at the killer. And the killer shouted something right back. And then before Kay could possibly understand what was happening, the killer rushed forward, grabbed Kay's steak knife, and slashed the side of Kay's neck. Kay screamed, and the killer just froze, like they were stunned by what they'd just done. In that moment of hesitation, Kay put a hand to her neck to try to stop the bleeding, pulling herself out of her chair, and then she tried to run out of the room. But the killer, filled with rage, rushed after Kay and managed to slash her neck 6 more times. The killer watched her fall to the floor. Kay struggled to pull herself up onto her hands and knees, but she was now bleeding profusely and her breath was quiet and shallow. The killer stood over her, raised the knife again, and was about to bring it back down for one final blow when suddenly they heard a sound coming from the steps that led to the basement. The killer stopped what they were doing and rushed over to the top of the steps and looked down to see what the noise was, and what the killer saw at the foot of the stairs was Bob standing in the doorway of his basement office. And when Bob saw the killer standing there with the steak knife in hand, he screamed for help. But there was no help coming, and Bob had nowhere to go. He was trapped in the basement. Without hesitation, the killer walked down the stairs and tried to slash at Bob's face. But Bob, who was trying to back up, managed to throw his hands up to protect himself, and so the knife only cut into his hands. Bob managed to stumble back into his office, but the killer pursued, lunging at him again once inside and stabbing wildly at his neck. The strikes started to land, and before long Bob had fallen to the ground, at which point the killer stabbed him several more times in the chest before finally stopping and standing up. In total, Bob was stabbed 17 times, including blows that severed his left and right carotid arteries in his neck, which supply blood to the brain. Bob lay motionless on the floor of his office, with blood pooling all around him as he died. The killer stood there for a minute in a daze, gasping for breath and staring down at Bob's now dead body. But then the killer snapped out of it and remembered Kay might still be alive upstairs. So the killer ran out of Bob's office, back upstairs into the living room, and saw Kay was now gone. But the killer saw a path of blood on the floor that led out of the living room to the open sliding glass door that led to the backyard. Following the path of blood, the killer ran to the back of the house where they slammed their hand on that glass door, which is how the bloody print was left, and then the killer stepped outside. The killer could see their own breath in the cold night air, and they could feel the snow crunch under their shoes. But the adrenaline made their face and hands feel flushed and hot. Then, in the moonlight, the killer saw Kay slowly staggering through the yard, desperately trying to get away. Blood dripped from her neck and left dark red pools behind her in the snow. Kay tried to scream for help, but the cuts from the killer's knife had damaged her neck and throat, and so she couldn't make enough sound to be heard. As the killer watched Kay moving through the yard, the urge to cause her as much pain as possible suddenly took over. The killer looked around the yard and spotted a wood-splitting maul, which is like a sledgehammer with a sharp axe head, leaning against a pile of firewood. Then the killer slipped the knife into their jeans pocket, walked over and grabbed the maul with both hands, and then ran over to Kay. When the killer reached her, she was barely able to stand. The killer raised the wood-splitting maul and slammed it into the back of Kay's head. Her skull cracked, and then she crumpled to the ground. Even though Kay was now dead, the killer was not done with her. They wanted to humiliate her. So the killer stripped Kay naked except for one sock. But after the killer tossed Kay's pajamas to the ground, they suddenly started to panic. It was like, for the first time, they realized what they had just done. The killer's hands were shaking, and they saw that their clothes were covered in blood, but they knew they had to get rid of the weapons, so they walked through the yard away from the house. They wiped down the handles of the maul and the knife with a clean part of their shirt, and then threw them into the woods that surrounded the Schwartz's backyard. Then the killer walked back through the yard past Kay's body and went inside the Schwartz's house. Once inside, the killer walked through the house to the laundry room where they stripped off their clothes, piled them into the washing machine, and then hit start. At this point, the killer's head was pounding, their arms and back ached, and they felt exhausted, so they walked upstairs, headed down the hall past Annie's room, and glanced at the door that led to Michael's old room. Then the killer stepped past that door to his own door that led to his bedroom, and he climbed into his own bed and went to sleep. Larry Schwartz, who everybody thought was the quiet, sweet, perfect son, was in fact the killer. The results of the FBI tests made it clear that the bloody palm print on the sliding glass door belonged to Larry and not to Michael, like so many people had thought. And when Detective Barr learned the palm print was Larry's, he thought back to the beginning of his investigation when he first spoke to Larry and Annie right after he had arrived at the crime scene. And he would come to understand that little Annie thought of her 5'9" brother, Larry, as being a, quote, very tall person, because pretty much everyone who was over 5'5" seemed very tall to her. But Larry, thinking on his feet, had immediately used her description of the very tall man in the backyard, the likely killer, to his advantage, pointing out that his former brother, Michael, was in fact very tall, 6'4" to be exact, which is considered very tall by basically all adults. Michael did this, of course, to deflect suspicion away from himself. Police arrested Larry, and while in custody, he would confess to killing his parents. Larry claimed he had killed Kay in the house and had not chased her down and killed her in the yard like the police said. But Larry's memory of the night was fuzzy, and Detective Barr didn't think Larry's version of events fit with the evidence found in the backyard and in the house. But Barr did take Larry at his word when Larry explained why he had killed his parents. Larry said that once Michael had been kicked out of the house, he, Larry, became the target of Kay and Bob's very strict disciplinary tactics. They would yell at Larry constantly about his bad grades, ground him for weeks at a time, and keep him from going out on dates with the girl he liked. Larry grew very angry at his parents, and he felt like they enjoyed humiliating him. And then, on January 16, 1984, Larry snapped. That night, after Annie had gone to bed, he and Kay got into a shouting match when he told her he had failed his Spanish exam. And Kay said that knowing Larry, he would probably fail all of his other exams too. So Larry stormed upstairs to his bedroom, slammed his door, reached under his bed, and grabbed a soda bottle that was actually filled with rum. And as he drank the rum, he got angrier at his parents, and he convinced himself that they were going to kick him out of the house like they'd done to Michael, and he'd never get to see his little sister Annie again. So Larry decided the only solution was to kill Kay and Bob. So he went downstairs and did just that. Larry ultimately pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but after serving 9 years, he was granted parole. Larry would move to Florida, where he would die from a heart attack in 2004 at the age of 38. Located in the middle of America is a little town called Hartford, Wisconsin. Downtown, they have the biggest automobile museum in all of Wisconsin. They also have a bowling alley called Dave's Lanes, which sells cheap beer and the best frozen pizza in town. Around the corner from the museum and Dave's Lanes are two other very popular local spots. One is called Scoop DeVille, which is an ice cream parlor that's themed like it's the 1950s, and they specialize in raspberry sundaes. And the other popular spot is called the Mine Shaft, and it's this big family-friendly restaurant that offers comfort food and arcade games. On warmer days, you can find residents of Hartford out on the many walking trails of Woodlawn and Willowbrook, which are two big, very well-maintained parks that are right outside of the downtown area. And on virtually any day, whether it's warm or cold, you can find Hartford residents packed into the Shower Arts Center, which is a local theater, to watch the local theater troupe perform. But none of these attractions are why anybody knows about Hartford, Wisconsin. The reason we know about Hartford, Wisconsin is because of Jessie Blodgett. Jessie Blodgett was a miracle. She was born just outside of Atlanta, Georgia in 1994 to her loving parents, Buck and Joy Blodgett. And Buck and Joy, for the longest time, they couldn't have kids. In fact, they were kind of adjusting to their reality that they would not be able to have biological children when Joy discovered she was pregnant. The couple couldn't believe it. It was like the most incredible thing that either of them had ever experienced. Joy would give birth to Jessie at home with no drugs, no doctors, just Buck, his mom, and a midwife. And when little Jessie poked her head into the world for the first time, Buck and Joy fell instantly in love with her. Not long after Jessie's birth, the Blodgett family would leave Atlanta, Georgia, and move to Hartford, Wisconsin. And it was there, inside of their modest 2-story home, about 5 minutes drive from the downtown, that Jessie would grow up. And it was also inside of that modest 2-story home where many years later, Jessie would come face to face with a monster. Jessie was always someone the other kids looked up to. She was a brilliant musician who could sing, and she could play the piano and the violin. One of her very close friends growing up, a girl named Jacqueline Knights, said that whenever she went over to Jessie's house, she would walk in and have to yell at the top of her lungs just to get Jessie's attention because Jessie was permanently playing the piano. But Jessie's musical talents were not the only reason people were attracted to her. From a young age, Jessie became outraged by bullying and unfairness of any kind, and so very quickly she developed a very strong moral compass. She became a fierce defender of animal rights, environmentalism, sustainability, social justice, and ultimately ending violence against women. By the time she graduated from high school in 2012, Jessie had become very popular amongst her peers and also amongst teachers and parents. Jessie just came off as someone who was wise beyond her years. Jessie always talked about wanting to change the world, and after high school, she kind of figured out how she was going to do that. She decided she would study to become a choir director for either a university or a high school, because through that role, she would be able to teach and mentor upwards of 100 young lives every single year. So in the fall of 2012, Jessie would leave Hartford and head off to the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, which is about an hour southeast of Hartford, and there she would enroll in their musical education program. And during that first year at the school, Jessie did so well in that program that she was offered a talent scholarship for the following year. After wrapping up her incredibly successful freshman year in college, Jessie came back to Hartford, Wisconsin to live with her parents for the summer. Now, unlike other college kids that were back home for the summer, Jessie was not treating this break like it was a vacation. Instead, she decided she would just jump right into her musical education career. And so as soon as she got home, she started her own business, teaching voice and piano and violin to kids in Hartford. And within weeks of starting this brand new business, she had over 25 kids signed up. When Jessie wasn't teaching that summer, she was often writing original music with her friend Dan Bartelt, who was also a very talented local musician. Or when she wasn't doing that, she was rehearsing at the Shower Arts Center, where that summer she had auditioned for and landed a central role in that summer's musical, The Fiddler on the Roof. Jessie was the fiddler, and she was very excited about this. The musical opened to a packed house on Friday, July 12th at 7:30 p.m., and Jessie and the rest of her cast were incredible. And then the next night, July 13th, Saturday, they had another big performance at 7:30 as well. And then on Sunday, July 14th, they had a matinee performance at 2 p.m. After that matinee, Jessie and the rest of her castmates headed off to another cast member's house who had a pool, and they had a big pool party to celebrate the end of their opening weekend. And during this party, Jessie spent half of her time sitting around the pool with her castmates, and the other half of the time she spent petting llamas that were in a nearby field. Jessie would finally leave the party and get back to her parents' house sometime after midnight, and when she went inside, her mother, Joy, was still awake. And so when Joy heard her daughter, she came out to the front of the house, and she was getting ready to ask Jessie, how was the party, when she noticed right away that something was off about Jessie. She looked upset about something. And so Joy asked her, are you okay? And so Jessie looked like she was about to maybe go into a lengthy explanation about why she was feeling the way she was feeling, but ultimately Jessie just kind of stopped herself, and in a tone that was less upset and more just annoyed, she would tell her mom, the guys in the cast, there are these two older guys that were kind of hitting on me, and, those are my friends, and I felt like they were crossing the line, and it was just totally uncomfortable. And so Joy began asking some follow-up questions to get a sense of, how serious this was, and it just seemed like it wasn't that serious. And pretty quickly, the two women said goodnight to each other, and they both retired to their rooms to go to bed. The next morning, Buck and Joy got up fairly early, around 7 a.m., and Jessie, she stayed in bed because her only commitment that day was a lesson she was teaching one of her students at around noon, and they'd be coming by the house for that lesson. And so her parents knew she was sleeping in, and so Buck and Joy, they're kind of going about their morning routine. Buck left ahead of Joy, probably around 7 or 7:30, and then at 8 a.m., Joy, right before she left the house, she brought some laundry up to Jessie's room. And so she opens Jessie's door, she goes inside, Jessie's asleep, and Joy, she puts the laundry down, and she considers going over and waking her daughter up just to say good morning and maybe goodbye. But she thought to herself, Jessie never gets a chance to sleep in. She's always got something going on, and so I'll let her sleep. And so Joy just quietly left the room, she shut the door behind her, and she headed off to work. At around noon, Joy would leave her office and head back home for her lunch break. And so when she walked into her home, she was expecting to see Jessie awake because Jessie had one of her students arriving any time. But when she walked inside, the house was silent. Jessie was not downstairs. She apparently was not awake, and Joy had seen her car out in the driveway, so she knew she hadn't left. And so kind of annoyed, Joy walked to the foot of the stairs and she yelled upstairs for Jessie to wake up. Hey, your student's going to be here any minute. And then Joy left the foot of the stairs and walked into the kitchen and made herself something to eat. After a little while, as she's finishing making her lunch, Joy hears a knock on the front door. And now at this point, Joy is really annoyed because Jessie has still not made a sound. She has not come downstairs. And so Joy, she goes over to the front door, she opens it up, and sure enough, it's Jessie's student. She asks the student to come inside and wait for a minute. And then Joy hustles up the stairs. She goes right over to Jessie's bedroom. She opens the door up. Jessie's still in bed. And so Joy runs over to her to jostle her awake. But as soon as she is standing right above the bed, right over her daughter, and she has a clear look down at her daughter's face, she freezes. Moments later, she would call 911.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Hartford 901, what's your emergency?
My daughter is blue. I went to wake her up, and I just got home from lunch, and she won't wake up.
She's
oh
19.
My God.
Okay, hang on just a second. Okay, so is she breathing?
I don't think so, no. Her pants are all wet, and she's got, it looks like strangulation marks.
There are strangulation marks?
That's what it looks like. I don't know what's going on.
Joy would gently pull her daughter out of the bed and lay her down on the ground. She would put a pillow underneath her head, and then she would begin doing chest compressions to try to save her daughter's life. But it was already too late. When police and paramedics arrived moments later, they came into the bedroom and they quickly determined that Jessie was deceased. When police looked at Jessie's body, they too saw the marks on her neck that her mother had referenced on the 911 call, and they also saw the same ligature marks on her left wrist and also on her ankles. As a result of these findings, the police on scene quickly concluded that this was not a naturally occurring death, this was not a suicide, this was a homicide. And so, as gently as they could, the police ushered Joy out of her daughter's bedroom and led her downstairs, because at this point, her daughter's bedroom was a crime scene, and they needed to keep it pristine so they could find evidence to figure out who did this. Once downstairs, Joy was reunited with her very distraught husband, Buck, who had just come home as well, and the two of them, their life is destroyed. Their beautiful baby girl, their only child, is now suddenly gone, and it didn't make any sense. During the search of Jessie's bedroom, and then also the Blodgett house at large, the police were not able to find any cord or rope or ligatures that could have been used to strangle Jessie to death. The police also noted that there was no sign of forced entry anywhere in the house, and it appeared nothing in the house was stolen. And so quickly, the lead Hartford police detective named Richard Thickens began operating under the assumption that the killer knew Jessie and targeted Jessie, that they would have known where she was in the house, they knew how to get in the house, and they went straight for her, they killed her, and they left. When Detective Thickens spoke with Buck and Joy just hours after they had discovered their daughter dead, he asked them if they had any idea who would want to hurt their daughter. And at first, the parents said, no, we don't know anyone. But after some more prodding, Buck would say, well, recently there were some tree limb cutters that were cutting limbs right outside of Jessie's bedroom window. And so maybe they looked in and they saw a teenage girl who was all alone, and they came in and they attacked her. And then Buck also said that in addition to teaching music that summer, Jessie had picked up a few hours working at a restaurant down the road. And recently, she had come into conflict with one of her coworkers who began acting very inappropriately with her. He basically would walk past Jessie and intentionally bump into her and rub into her and just get inside of her personal space. And this coworker was aware of the fact that Jessie was really upset and had already told her family. And so perhaps this coworker was disgruntled and was seeking revenge. Also, Joy would point out to the detective that the night before, when Jessie came home, she had seemed really upset about something. She had said it was about these two guys that, were hitting on her at the party, and it made her uncomfortable, but Joy and Jessie didn't really get into it. So there was something obviously on her mind the night that she was killed. Following this discussion, Detective Thickens would go out and track down those tree trimmers. He would also track down the co-worker at the restaurant, and he discovered that they had rock-solid alibis and they were ruled out as suspects. As for the two older guys, the cast members from the pool party that had made Jessie uncomfortable, Detective Thickens found them, and he very quickly ruled out one of them, but he was not able to rule out the other. His name was Randy Talley. When Detective Thickens spoke to Randy on July 15th, the day that Jessie was found, Randy would deny having anything to do with Jessie's death. When Detective Thickens asked him, where were you the night before after the cast party, where'd you go, and then where were you this morning, Randy would tell him that after the party, he went back to his apartment, and that is where he has been the entire time until right then. When Detective Thickens asked him if there was anyone that could corroborate his story, Randy said no, he was alone in his apartment the entire time. Shortly after speaking with Randy, the police were still searching Jessie's bedroom for evidence, and they discovered her diary. And her final entry in this diary only made Randy seem more suspicious. Despite downplaying the incident that Jessie had had with these two older cast members at the pool party, after Jessie had spoken with her mom briefly when she got back from the party, she had gone up to her room and then made this final diary entry. And in it, she talks about being really upset about what these two guys had done to her. She said that these two guys were corrupting her and that they were taking what should be platonic love and perverting it into a competition. Her closing lines seemed to indicate that she might have been expecting some sort of future confrontation with these two guys. The lines read, "I am not helpless. I will recognize problems and confront them without fear. God be with me. Between Randy's lack of an alibi and then Jessie's kind of ominous final message that seemed to be talking about Randy, Randy quickly became the primary suspect in this murder investigation. But Randy's cell phone records indicated that he had not had any interaction, no calls, no text messages, with Jessie leading up to her death, and around the time in the morning of July 15th when she would have been killed, Randy's cell phone was in his apartment, far away from Jessie's house. And so while this didn't definitively mean that Randy could not have killed Jessie because he could have just left his cell phone at his apartment when he carried out the attack, what it did mean was there wasn't any real evidence to support the idea that Randy killed Jessie. And so the Hartford police had to go back to the drawing board and try to find new leads to chase down. And on July 16th, just 24 hours after Jessie was discovered, the police would get a huge lead. Three days before Jessie was killed, a young woman about the same age as Jessie, named Melissa Richards, decided to take her dog for a walk in a park in Richfield, Wisconsin, which is a small town about 10 miles southeast of Hartford. When Melissa pulled her car into the dirt parking lot that connected to the walking trail she intended to go on, she noticed there was only one other car parked in this lot, and it was immediately on her left, pointed nose away from the entrance. It was this blue minivan. And so as she's driving in, she looked over at it and she noticed the driver had their legs poking out of the driver's side window as if they were laying down across the front seats. And so this didn't really matter to Melissa, but she definitely took note of this person in this van. And so she drives past the blue van on her left. She drives all the way across to the other side of the dirt lot. She parks her car, she hops out, she gets her little dog Remy out of the car, and then she walks away from the parking lot and heads onto the walking trail into the woods. The trail that she was walking on was basically a big loop that ended at the entrance to the dirt parking lot. And so when she was done with her walk, she would be walking directly across the entire parking lot, which would mean she would be walking on foot past that blue minivan if it was still there when she was done. And so Melissa does a 30-minute loop. She gets all the way around and she reaches the entrance to the parking lot, and she sees the blue minivan is still parked where it was, except the driver no longer has their feet poking out of the window. Now she can't see if there's anybody in the van at all. And so Melissa, again, she's not really thinking about this. It's crossing her mind, but she's not on edge about this van. And so she lets go of the leash of Remy, and Remy starts running to the car, and Melissa pulls out her key fob and she opens up the trunk to the car. And so Remy runs over, he leaps into the car, and then Melissa just continues to walk across the lot towards her vehicle. And when Melissa walks just far enough that she is past the blue minivan, she turns to look at it and she sees the person who had been sticking their legs out of the window, the driver, is now sitting in the passenger seat of the blue minivan. The door is open and this person is sitting there staring at Melissa. And so Melissa, she makes quick eye contact with this person and immediately averts her gaze. She doesn't want to be rude, and she just keeps on walking towards her vehicle. But again, she's not worried about what's happening with this van. She's just aware of this person and this van. But after averting her gaze, she hears the sound of someone running towards her from behind. And so she whips her head around and she sees the same person who was sitting in the passenger seat, the driver of this van, has run up to her. And as soon as she turned around to face this person, they came to a complete stop and they were just staring directly at Melissa. They were only about 10 feet apart. And Melissa kind of reflexively said, "Oh, you scared me." And then Melissa just turned her back on this person and continued walking towards her vehicle. And after taking only a couple of steps, once again, she heard the sound of this person behind her start running towards her. And immediately she whips her head around again and again. This person comes to an abrupt stop as soon as Melissa's looking at them. Except now Melissa knows something's not right. And worst of all, she looks down and in this person's right hand by their hip is a knife. A split second later, this person charges Melissa. They tackle Melissa to the ground. Melissa smashes down onto her stomach and she's pinned on her stomach. And this person, they attempt to stab Melissa, but Melissa fights back like mad. She turns over and she grabs the blade of the knife and she wrestles it away from her attacker, and she pulls the knife under her body and she puts it under all of her weight. And the attacker is so surprised that this has happened, they actually stop for a second before kind of reaching down and trying to yank the knife out from underneath Melissa, but Melissa is not letting it go. And so finally, the attacker just kind of sits up on her back and says, "Can I just go?" And Melissa says, "No." But at that exact moment, the attacker leapt up and started running back towards the blue minivan. And so Melissa, she's not waiting around to see what they're going to do. And so she jumps up. She's still got the knife in her hand. Her hands are completely ruined. Melissa runs to her car. She leaps inside. She throws the bloody knife onto the floorboard of the passenger seat. After making sure Remy is in the car with her, she shuts the back hatch, she locks the doors, and then she turns around and she sees her attacker in the van peeling out of the lot driving away. And so Melissa is relieved, but she also just wants to get the heck away from where she is right now. She's totally alone. And so she fires up her car and she drives to the hospital. After getting 15 stitches to repair the 3 very deep cuts in her hands, Melissa was transferred to a recovery room where a man named Joel Klossing, who was a detective with the Washington County Sheriff Department, he came into the room and he took down Melissa's statement. Now, Melissa was very shaken up about what had just happened. She had no idea who this person was, why they attacked her. But despite being shaken up, Melissa had the most incredible memory of the event. She knew exactly what her attacker looked like, all the little details, and she knew everything about the vehicle, to include the fact that she knew it was a Dodge Caravan minivan. So she knew the exact type of car, and she guessed it was probably from the years 2000 to 2002. And so Melissa gives this incredible statement, and Detective Klossing, he goes back and he has a composite sketch made of the attacker, and then on this sheet that showed the attacker, there was a description of the vehicle and where it was located and some details of the case. And so Detective Klossing releases this sketch and the information to the media, and he puts it around town, and he's expecting someone in town to know who this person is because the description is so good. And someone would come forward. On July 16th, so one day after Jessie had been killed, a deputy from the Washington County Sheriff Department, he came forward and said, "Hey, I saw your flyer and I read the description Melissa gave about the type of vehicle this person was using, and I have seen that vehicle parked in the exact same spot in that park. I was there a couple of weeks ago. I saw it there. There was something weird about it. The driver was acting strange. And so I actually ran the license plates to see if there was some outstanding warrants or something going on with this person. But after I ran the plates, nothing came up. And so I kind of just forgot about it. But now I've read this description and I'm pretty convinced it's the same exact vehicle. And so I can pull those plates that I ran and we can see who owned that vehicle and, maybe it's a match." And so the deputy, he pulls up the information that he had pulled from the license plates of the van he had seen a couple of weeks earlier. And when they looked at the owner of that minivan, there was just no way they matched the description that Melissa gave. It just could not be the same person. And so briefly, Detective Klossing and the deputy believed that, okay, it was just some big coincidence that a very similar blue minivan was parked in the exact same spot a couple of weeks apart. But when Detective Klossing looked a little bit deeper into who the owner of that vehicle was, he would discover they had a relative that matched exactly the description that Melissa gave of her attacker. And so on the afternoon of July 16th, so one day after Jessie has been killed, Detective Klossing tracks down the phone number of the relative who looks exactly like the attacker, and he punches that number into his cell phone and he put the phone to his ear. At the same time, 10 miles to the northwest, Buck and Joy Blodgett were hosting a vigil for their daughter in their home. And so all of Jessie's very close friends and family, they were all there in the living room, and they were sitting around in a big circle, crying together, grieving together, and then also sharing their favorite memories of Jessie. And so while they're all doing that, a phone starts to ring inside of the circle. And the owner of that phone, 19-year-old Daniel Bartelt, who was a very close friend of Jessie's and who had spent much of that summer coming over to the Blodgett household to make original music with Jessie, he stands up and he walks quietly away from the group, and then he answers the phone, and it's Detective Klossing asking Daniel, to come into the station to talk about Melissa Richards. Daniel would make his way to the police station that afternoon, and he would be interviewed by Detective Klossing and another detective. And even though they had brought Daniel in to talk to him about Melissa Richards, it was not lost on these detectives how strange it was that Daniel is at the home of a recently murdered young woman where that case is unsolved, and he is now the suspect of another attack on another young woman that happened only a couple of days earlier and only a couple of miles away. And so as soon as Daniel sits down, Detective Klossing kind of casually asks him, hey, why were you at Jessie Blodgett's house when I called you? And Daniel would say, well, I'm very close with Jessie, and so we were there as part of her vigil because she was killed yesterday. And so the detective kind of did gradually shift to Melissa Richards, which Daniel would say he had nothing to do with. But as they began asking him questions about Melissa, Detective Klossing and the other detective noticed that there were cuts on Daniel's hands. And so they kind of cut him off and they asked Daniel, how'd you get these cuts on your hands? And Daniel was very quick to say, well, I got them at work. A screw kind of jutted out and cut my hands. I move inventory around in a back room of an engineering company. That's my job. And, I just cut my hand at work. And so at that point, the police began really asking very pointed questions about exactly how he hurt his hands and what exactly did he do at his job. And at some point, when it just seemed like there was something off about his story about how he hurt himself, one of the detectives just says to Daniel, if I were to call your employer, this engineering company, would they say you, Daniel, are currently employed with them? And Daniel, he kind of paused for a minute and then said, no, I actually lost my job several weeks ago. And so now the detectives knew he had to be lying about how he cut his hand because he's just told them that he hurt it at work recently, but he wasn't employed recently. And so Detective Klossing kind of leans in and says, Daniel, so how'd you really hurt your hand? And so Daniel, he begins talking about how he cut it cooking. And Detective Klossing is like, Daniel, nobody would lie about cutting their hand cooking. So why don't you just tell us the truth? And amazingly, Daniel would. He would admit after some serious pressure that he hurt himself attacking Melissa Richards. He told detectives that after he lost his job a few weeks earlier, he didn't want his parents to know he had lost his job, and so he had just continued getting up early and leaving the house and coming back later in the day, kind of acting like he had been at work all day, when in reality all he was doing was driving around town and sometimes going to parks and just sitting in parking spots in parks. And so on July 12th, the day that Melissa was attacked, that's exactly what Daniel was doing. He was pretending to be at work by sitting in that parking space in that dirt lot in Richfield, and at some point, he saw Melissa, and he decided he just wanted to attack her. He told detectives that recently he had become overwhelmed in college, and so he had dropped out, and then he lost his job, and so combined, he was just feeling kind of scared of life. That's how he described it. And so he wanted somebody else to feel scared too, and so that was why he said he attacked Melissa. But despite admitting to this vicious, violent crime against Melissa Richards, Daniel, when asked if he had any connection to the Jessie Blodgett murder, he would say, absolutely not. I love Jessie. I would never hurt her. But when Detective Klossing reached out to Detective Thickens of the Hartford Police and told them you should look at Daniel as a potential suspect in your murder case, it would quickly come to light that Daniel was lying again. Daniel was raised in a good, loving family. He was extremely smart, straight-A student. He was an incredible musician, and he was really well respected by his peers and even by his teachers and other instructors. I mean, this was a kid who had everything going for him, but something went wrong with Daniel, and no one knows exactly why. Shortly before he attacked Melissa, Daniel had become obsessed with killing and death and murder. His internet search history shows that he spent a lot of time looking for actual snuff videos online. Those are videos of actual murder. He also spent a lot of time looking up serial killers and spree killers, and he was especially interested in anybody who killed lots and lots of women. And then finally, right before he would attack Melissa, Daniel, based on his search history, had discovered this one particular pornographic snuff film, and it was of this woman who was all tied up and hogtied, and after being assaulted, she was strangled. And Daniel watched this video over and over and over and over again. On that day, July 12th, as Daniel is pretending to be at work, he's sitting in his car, he looks out and he sees Melissa, she's all alone, and something clicks in his head where he decides he's going to go reenact that wretched pornographic snuff film on Melissa. And so Melissa was likely just at the wrong place at the wrong time. Recovered in that dirt parking lot after the attack was this special, very strong tape that had been in Daniel's pockets during the attack. It had just fallen out. And so it's believed he was going to use that tape to subdue Melissa and then abduct her. But obviously Melissa fought back and Daniel got spooked and ran off. 3 days later, on July 15th, it's believed that Daniel decided he wanted to try again. He wanted to act out this pornographic snuff film, but in real life. And this time, he wasn't going to leave it up to some random victim. He needed his victim to be totally helpless. He needed his victim not to fight back. And who better than 19-year-old Jessie Blodgett, his close friend who inherently trusted him and would easily let him into her house, into her bedroom. It wouldn't matter if she was all alone because she felt safe around him. Based on eyewitness testimony of someone who was driving through the Blodgett neighborhood on the morning that Jessie was killed, it's believed Daniel arrived in the driveway of the Blodgett household just a few minutes after Buck and Joy had left for work. And so he pulled into the driveway knowing that Jessie was all alone. We don't know exactly what happened inside of that house. We don't know if Jessie came down and opened the door or if she was still upstairs sleeping. But Daniel, he entered the house, and when he went inside, he was prepared for what he was about to do. He literally had a bag full of supplies. Things like that special tape, there were ligatures, cords, ropes, there was alcohol wipes, zip ties. And so he makes his way upstairs to Jessie's bedroom. And then once he's in there, we don't know if Jessie was awake or sleeping at this time. But either way, Daniel jumped on top of her and immediately put a homemade ball gag into her mouth and then wrapped that special tape around her head to make sure the gag stayed in her mouth. And then once she couldn't make a sound, he bound her wrists and her ankles and he hogtied her, and then he viciously assaulted her. And then after he was done, he wrapped some cord around her neck and he strangled her to death. After she was deceased, Daniel attempted to clean her body with some alcohol wipes. And then after that, he kind of repositioned her in her bed with the covers up over her to give the appearance that she was still sleeping to her parents when they inevitably would find her. Then Daniel rounded up all of his murder supplies back into his bag, except he did accidentally leave one of those special rolls of tape underneath Jessie's bed, and then he slipped out of the Blodgett household, and then he drove to Woodlawn Park, where he disposed of his supplies into one of the trash cans. The next day, at Jessie's vigil, Daniel would attend, and according to the other people that were there, Daniel was by far the most talkative person in that circle. Daniel would ultimately be found guilty of murdering Jessie Blodgett, although he never admitted guilt. In fact, during the sentencing phase, Buck Blodgett would give this incredibly eloquent and heart-wrenching speech about what it was like to lose his only child. And toward the end of this speech, Buck turned to his right, so away from the judge who he had been addressing, and he looked directly at Daniel, and Daniel looked back at him, and Buck says, "Dan, I forgive you as I have every day since I found out it was you." And then a few moments later, Buck would also say to Dan, "Dan, not only do I forgive you, but I love you." But when Daniel got his turn to stand up and say something on his behalf, he turned to face Buck and Joy, and looking right at them, he would tell them that he's innocent and that he doesn't have any answers for them because he didn't do it and his conscience is clear. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and as far as we know, he still denies having killed Jessie, despite the mountain of evidence against him. In the days following Jessie's death, Buck Blodgett walked into his daughter's bedroom, and he laid down on her bed, and looking straight up, he tried to hold his breath for as long as he possibly could. And as he began to struggle, he started to imagine what it was like for his poor daughter in her final moments as she's being murdered, and it just crushed him. He thought to himself, I wasn't there for my little girl when she needed me the most. But instead of just carrying that terrible burden around with him for the rest of his life, Buck and his family decided they had to do something to honor their daughter's memory and maybe even change the world, which was something that Jessie always talked about wanting to do. And so Buck would go on to start the Love is Greater Than Hate project, which is this incredible charity whose mission is designed to end male-on-female violence and to inspire love over hate. Buck's charity is a recipient of a Mr. Ballin Foundation grant, and if you have been moved by this story in some way, I would highly encourage you to contribute to Buck's charity. You can find the link to their website below where you can donate. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please ask the 5-star review button to help you move out of your apartment and offer them beer and pizza as payment. But once they accept and the move is complete, only serve them O'Doul's and anchovy pizza. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those